Welcome back. We are looking at human populations. We have looked at what the growth curve looks like for human populations. We've looked at age, gender distributions, and now we're going to focus on what are the consequences of the human population growth rate for the future. Big questions, important questions, and certainly questions that you, as the young people who are one day going to be making very important decisions about the future of our planet, these are questions that you need to think about very carefully. So, looking at the future, these are the key words that I spoke to you earlier on about that we are going to be focusing on. When we estimate something, I suppose you could call it a guess, but it's a very informed guess, and you need to look at data in order to make the guess. So it's not just simply, oh, I think, it's I think based against what the data says. A prediction and a forecast are very similar. They are looking at what we estimate will happen in the future. So forecast looks at the future, and a prediction is something that we state that we think, given the current data, the future will look like. Remember that when we look at consequences, we're looking at what is going to happen. We've got certain results that we need to expect. These are consequences that we need to bear in mind if we're going to be able to manage the future. So these are keywords that you're going to see associated with the next part of the work that we look at. Now, when we make predictions and we look at consequences, it means we're looking into the future, but based on patterns and data that we have in the past. And scientists have said that going right forward to the year 2100, we must expect the population of South Africa to start leveling off. And we see that that deceleration is probably going to start taking place at around 2050. So the graph that I showed you before the break was here at 1950. What happens in the next 50 years? Because look at what scientists predict. They predict that from moving from that typical age pyramid of an expanding population, scientists are predicting that we're going to be moving towards a more stationary population growth. So 1950, this was the graph that I originally showed you, that showed a definite expanding population pattern. By the time the South African population had moved from 1950, 40 years later, into 1990, we see the same kind of pattern. These two patterns are very, very similar. And so if we put this onto a line graph, we'd see starting 1950, going up to 1990, exactly as the age gender distribution indicates, we see an expansion in the South African human population. Let's take it a little bit further forward. Let's now go to 2015 and compare that with 2020. What do we see? We see that we have not got such a steep graph happening with that typical expanding population. We're starting to see that this is becoming a little bit more stable. And so up to 2020 on our graph, we're starting to see the beginnings of a deceleration. And therefore, we move into the area of making predictions in 2100 that original curve became modified, and scientists predict that we would have reached a stage of stationary growth or stability. South African population would have hit the carrying capacity of the country, the particular area that the South African population is growing in. This means that limiting factors will now control the human population. It means that the human population is no longer able to simply grow. We're going to start seeing consequences: running out of food, running out of water, increase in human waste, which means pollution, and that these things are going to start impacting negatively on the South African population. And it's not just the South African population. We're exploring that because this is our home, but we see similar patterns in so many other developing countries as well. And that leads us to then say why. The number of humans is steadily increasing, but the number of natural resources is decreasing. And these natural resources are, of course, the things that are our limiting factors. The limiting factors, things like food, water, space, the amount of waste that is building up is also very important, because very often the amount of waste and pollution that builds up impacts negatively on natural resources, such as water, for example. If the water is contaminated, that means although it might physically be there, it's undrinkable or unusable, and so therefore the natural resource has decreased. So as the human population increases in size, so the numbers of natural resources decrease. And we've hit the point never before in human history that limiting factors are starting to overturn our fighting against those limiting factors. And the limiting factors indicate that we have hit carrying capacity. Maybe we've actually even gone beyond the carrying capacity of South Africa for the number of humans in the country. Another prediction relating to consequences is that as the human population increases in millions, so does the extinction rate of other populations that we share the space with. So humans are not only poisoning and using up natural resources, we are causing the extinction of other populations. I think that you're very aware, particularly in South Africa, of the rhino population and how hunting and poaching of the rhinos is bringing that population rate down until we're starting to see extinctions happening. And the rhinos are just one very large and prominent example. There are many other amphibians, insects, and other small important organisms in the environment that are going extinct because humans are in some way making their environment negative, taking away the space, taking away their natural resources. So extinction rates increasing is a very important consequence of the increase in the human population. This is a very interesting graph that will help us make predictions and look at consequences in terms of comparing the population growth of developed and developing countries over the last 300 years. And we see that developed countries, we see that there is an increase. It starts to become exponential, but around about 1940, 1950, we start to see stabilization. But in developing countries that have less access to education, to medical assistance, we see that that growth rate becomes exponential. And if we are going to be looking at the world population 1950 to 2050, we see that in 1960, the human population passed the 3 billion point. The 4 billion point came in the mid-70s. The 5 billion point came in the late 1980s. Around about 2000, we hit the 6 billion mark. And in about 2011, we hit the 7 billion mark. So you can see that this is growing at an exponential rate. Scientists indicate or make the prediction that we're going to hit the 8 billion mark in 2025. So remember what I told you or asked you at the beginning of this lesson. How many humans do you think there are on Earth currently? Let's look at the growth curve, and we will see that in the mid-2020s, we are heading towards 8 billion. Now, in the past, in the years around 3 and 4 billion, even up to 5 billion, do you know what happened around those times? Humans celebrated and said, yes, we've hit the 4 billion mark, we've hit the 5 billion mark. And as humans and science became more aware of, oh no, there are terrible consequences of this, there's less and less reason to celebrate this increase in growth, because we know that with the increase in growth, terrible consequences are happening, and we see these consequences today. People starving, fights and wars being fought over arable or land that can be used for farming, over clean water. We see huge debates and the consequences of climate change as we pump more and more of our waste into the atmosphere. And so the question I want to leave you with today, should we celebrate the day of 8 billion? Is it something that we should be celebrating? Or is it something that we should be looking at very, very seriously? And that day of 8 billion will come around when you are young adults and when you are making the policies that control how we're going to handle things like climate change, population growth. You are the ones who are going to be making those decisions, and it's coming up very, very shortly. Let's have a look at a summary of what we've covered today. Humans are able to control, and not only control, but manipulate the factors that limit other populations. Humans have increased the carrying capacity of the earth for the human population. We have more food because we grow it. We're able to manipulate factors such as mortality with the use of medicines. And as a result, the human population growth curve is an exponential curve, and very importantly, there are serious consequences for us in terms of what is going to happen to the earth, to the other organisms that we share the earth with, and to the human population in the future. So, if we have a look at our topic mind map, we can see that we've reached the end of our work on population ecology. And we are going to do some revision exercises coming up, but I think I want to leave you with the very sobering thought. You are going to be the ones in control. You are the lawmakers of the future. How are you going to ensure that the human population and the way that it is growing and the way that it is controlling the environment don't in fact bring about a huge extinction of other organisms and impact negatively on our own population? But from me, for today, this is Mama H saying goodbye.